Ember Witch. Book 1. The Lich. Volume 1. Black Tragedy. Chapter 3. Half-Blood. October 21st to December 21st, 458 BME. Fragment 15. Depression. Irina stood in the kitchen doorway watching her husband preparing food. She smiled as he looked back at her. He smiled back, then began chopping vegetables once again. Irina turned around and walked to her room. The house she and her husband shared was small but cozy. 2 bedrooms, a tiny living room and an even smaller kitchen. It was crude and a far cry from her family's mansion, but she wouldn't complain. It was humbling to be where she was. She sat down at the desk in the corner and began writing. The letter she was writing was not a love note, nor was it some nothing letter about average mundane events. She was about to commit to something much larger and far more difficult than anything she had ever done before. Training in the Grand Mage's Hall, giving birth, marriage, none of it was as difficult as writing these few words. Just a few lines of ink on a page held her hostage. She was about to betray her entire life for the past 20 years due to her commitment to her kingdom. She knew she was struggling to keep her oath. She was still so young for her race. Only 86 years old, but still in her prime. Her red skin vibrant and smooth, her long horns protruding from her forehead showing her pure blood. Her deep brown hair flowed like silk around her shoulders. She was of noble blood, raised from wealth and power within the Elven kingdom. Despite the current royal family being of the Noki Elven, her family was next in line to inherit the throne if the Dorn family was to die out or prove unable to rule. She had an oath to her king that transcended a verbal agreement. She was bound by a pact set forth by every Sol delegate. She had to report back, had to inform her king of her progress. It wasn't just a simple life she had been living these past 20 years, although she wished it had been. Each of the Sol delegate were tasked with providing intelligence on each territory of the mainland. She was overseeing the Queen's Crown, Jimmer the Noki was overseeing the Heartland and Telrin, another Sol Elven was watching the deserts to the south. She had fallen in love with a human. She gave birth to a beautiful daughter who had recently returned to the mainland after training for several years under her own master within the Sol delegate. She was proud of Syria, knew she had been assigned to be the healer of the church within Meridia. She had put off reporting her situation for too long and knew even if she didn't there was no stopping what was to come. She could only hope that the king would take mercy upon Syria when the day eventually came. She finished her letter and sealed it with a wax symbol, then exited the house. She whistled, and a few minutes later a large bird flew down from one of the many ancient bladed monoliths her house was surrounded by. It landed on her arm and she placed the letter within a cylinder tied to its leg and sent it off. She stood there in the snow for a few minutes before she turned back and headed into her house and loving husband. Vera sat up in horror.
Fevra. Fevra.
She yelled out as her eyes adjusted to the dark cell she was in. She heard no reply from him and began fearing the worst. She stood up from the bedding feeling wobbly and weak. She was surprised to find that she had not been chained to the wall, however she could feel the binding spell that held her hostage within the walls of the cell. She moved slowly to the barred door and looked across the hall, trying to peer into the cell straight across from hers. To her delight, or as much delight as there could be when shut away in a prison, she saw Fevra sitting with his back against the wall in the cell across from hers. He looked as if he was dead, but he lifted his head to look at her.
What happened? Where the fuck are we?
She asked, trying to grasp the situation they had found themselves in. Fevra looked away from her as if he was ashamed of something.
What is happening, Fevra?
She asked again, getting more frustrated by the second.
How should I know? I was unconscious until just a few hours ago.
He replied, still not looking at her. His tone was that of utter defeat. He had come so far from when he was brought into the cinder. Overcoming his murder of his brother and being abandoned by his own people. He now however seemed to be at an irreversible level of self-pity.
Gods, can you just give me something to work off of here? Anything? Perhaps you overheard something or saw where we have been taken?
Vera questioned, but Fevra didn't look at her, not even acknowledging her.
Fucking speak to me. I thought you were over this self-pity bullshit already.
She screamed, grasping the bars of the cell. Fevra looked up then with a deep remorse and stood. He walked to the cell door and raised his arms, placing his left hand on the bars and showing the stump of his right arm. Vera gasped in horror as the memory came back to her. She had been only a few feet away from Takashi as his transparent yellow blade sliced through Fevra's arm. She couldn't react fast enough, move fast enough to stop it. Everything in that moment had seemed to move 10 times the speed of reality. She had been frozen in the moment as time flew by her, with nothing she could do.
Fuck.
She muttered and turned away. She slammed her fists into the wall and pressed her head to the cold stone.
I failed again. I failed to do anything. I am not fit to be your partner, Void. I'm not fit to be a cinder. I lost my sword arm, I lost the arm I used to hold your hand. Gods, I couldn't even hold my own against Takashi. I am nothing more than a gimp now. I deserve to rot away in here. I murdered my brother, I broke the trust of my pack, and on my first job I failed to do anything more than be in their way.
Fevra said, moving away from the door, and dropped himself back to the floor.
Takashi is dead. I killed him after you lost your arm,
Vera said as she paced the small room.
Oh, that's such a relief. At least he is dead, but we don't have Persian and we are locked up somewhere. Wherever we are, there is at least a healer. My arm has been mended to stave off infection, so at least I won't die from green fever,
Fevra said, sarcastically pointing to his arm, even though he knew Vera couldn't see it from where she paced. Cress had been pacing for 5 minutes, before Neela couldn't take any more of it.
Please sit down, Cress. You are causing yourself more stress than needed and annoying me in the process,
Neela said, trying to go over exactly what had transpired. They had received a letter an hour earlier that detailed a very serious issue. Vera, Takashi, Fevra, and a man named Persian had destroyed thousands of gold worth of property and items, caused a massive scene, and ended in the murder of Takashi. They had engaged in combat, leaving Fevra injured and Vera nearly dead, with Persian unconscious. Lion, the Morden of Halcyon, had no choice but to arrest the 3 surviving members of the fight for everything that had been done within the span of a few minutes. Currently, they were being held within Lion's dungeon, but would not be executed nor tried until Neela arrived to sort things out. Cress had been brought into this due to her father's involvement, however, she didn't seem to care about his fate. Instead, she was pacing back and forth over Fevra and Vera. The letter hadn't disclosed in what way he had been injured, and Neela had guessed it wasn't too serious, however Cress was convinced they would be in worse shape than Neela assumed. She hated that Vera was on the brink of death and that she couldn't do anything about it. Both of them were family to her, and if she couldn't help them she could only feel stressed. It was a stressful and difficult day, to say the least, for the both of them. Neela had known about Cress's family life for years at this point. Knew her mother was a whore within myopia and her father a criminal who survived off of theft. She had taken in Cress for the fact that she was skilled with color, however, it had been a hard decision nonetheless. When she had met Cress, she was only 12, multiple bruises and a black eye marked her face as Persian had clearly beaten her the day before. Cress had been someone else in her childhood, a different person altogether. It was the cinder that had given her a true home. She was able to grow into her own person without the malicious beatings from her father. Of course, training to become an assassin had its fair share of physical harm, but the bruises, broken bones, and black eyes she received here were never from hatred or anger.
You do realize that Persian was a wanted man, right? The only ones to know of this were you, me, Fevra and Vera. How and why was Takashi there? He had been gone for months when you assigned Vera the job, and a short while ago he murdered the Grand Bell Sage. Why in the void would he be after Persian?
Cress asked as she continued to pace.
We will have answers when we get Vera and Fevra out of Lion's prison, but for now please sit down,
Neela said, squeezing her eyes shut with her fingers in frustration.
We will deal with everything when we arrive, so please keep your emotions in check. We have a month's ride ahead of us and I doubt you want to be exhausted and frustrated when we leave.
Neela continued, which finally got Cress to stop moving around.
Fine. I will be ready by dawn. Have a good night.
Cress said, frustrated but respectfully. Vera and Fevra had been locked up for nearly a month at this point. She had learned that they were being held within Lion's dungeon after a week had passed. The guards had come into her cell with a mage who bound her magic, keeping her from trying to escape. They had returned a week later to do the same thing. Despite being fed every few days, the guards hadn't said anything to either her or Fevra besides for their warnings of not trying anything when they opened the door. She had a feeling that they had been given explicit orders not to talk or do anything to her nor Fevra, and she felt as if she understood the reason why. She couldn't be sure whether it was because they were cinders or because Lion had special plans for them, but she was frustrated by the silence. Fevra hadn't been the talkative type since they found themselves in their cells. He had fallen into himself. Vera was getting more and more angry at the moment due to his silence. She had been training him, living with him and understanding him for nearly a year at this point. She had grown so close to him in that time, but now she felt as if they had never met to begin with. Each day she would attempt to talk to him, but he would just ignore her. She would get short replies to her questions, if that. Fevra sat against the wall, sulking in his misery. He failed, he hadn't been able to do anything to save his brother, and now he sat locked in a prison missing an arm. He had been powerless to stop Takashi, while Vera had enough power to kill him. Was he worthy of being in her presence anymore? Did she view him as weak? He was terrified of speaking to her. He had no idea what she would say. She had been so hard on him over the entire time she had been training him. She chided him for every mistake he made. This was his greatest mistake yet. He felt like his life had been for nothing. He had lost his family, home, respect and dignity. He wanted to cry, throw something, break something, but he had no energy left. He was broken. Despite being unable to use their color, Vera could still feel Fevra's dark aura. Over the past year, she had gotten used to it. She felt comfortable in its thick presence, however now that she was unable to use her magic, his pressure sunk deep into her mind. She fought against the depression and sadness it threw out in waves, but it was difficult to stay above it all. She wanted to say something, but knew that he had no control over it. A prison cell was already a terrible place for anyone to be in. The darkness, the cold, the hard stone floors. It all weighed on the mind. She could only imagine what was running through Fevra's head at this point. He seemed to have succumbed to the dark pressure he exuded. After being cut off from her color, she began to study his pressure even more. It washed out like waves in the ocean. The feeling of despair would crash against her, then retreat for a time and crash against her once more. Every day they spent within their cells, cut off from magic, made the pressure worse. Lion walked down the small and tight staircase that spiraled several times before opening up into a damp and dark dungeon. Neela and Cress followed close behind, accompanied by a trio of armed guards holding torches to light the way.
I assume you have been keeping them here because of the destruction they caused to your city and not because they were on assignment outside their jurisdiction,
Neela said as they approached a cell.
They are here because they murdered someone with at least a dozen witnesses present. It doesn't matter if they are cinders, the law is the law. The Lai Ren was unconscious and severely injured, and the girl had used such a powerful soul spell it nearly killed her. They are both lucky to be alive and even more lucky that you showed up,
Lion said, and Neela nodded in agreement.
What about the male Fyern? I assume you are still holding him within these walls, or did you ship him off to another one of your fancy labor pits?
Neela asked after a moment.
He is still here. After my cinder identified Vera, I knew that there was more going on than a simple murder. We kept him locked in the last cell and as far away from the other two as we could to keep the problem from escalating any further. I brought you here to get to the bottom of everything. Why a cinder of myopia was murdered in broad daylight. Why a necromancer clan has spawned within my city, and why out of everything that has happened and could happen would a Lyren be under your command?
Lion said before stepping to the cell Vera was held in. As Cress inched closer, she could feel the darkness washing out of Fevra's cell. It made her shudder. Vera had heard the group coming down the stairs, and took to peering through the bars.
Neela, get me the fuck out of here. I have no idea why this bitch locked us up in the first place,
she said, shooting a look of hatred at Lion. Neela stepped forward and looked Vera in the eyes.
I can see the damage it has done. She is damn lucky to be alive,
Neela said, ignoring Vera's outburst.
I don't think that my binding spells are very effective against the Lyren. No doubt you can feel his darkness,
Lion said, turning towards Fevra's cell. Vera knew he wasn't going to stand up or say anything. He had been shut within himself for days.
Let me see the male Fyern. Surely he has been kept in just as fine conditions as my cinders,
Neela said, and Lion gestured, walking them down the hall.
Fucking seriously? Get me out of here. Fuck me.
Dara said as she watched Cress, Neela, Lion and her guards walk away. Fevra was sitting with his back against the cell door, staring down at the gray and brownstone floor. He didn't care that Neela was here. Didn't care if she was to release him. He knew he was unfit to be a cinder. On his first job, he had his arm severed. He was now crippled and unable to defend or attack. He was sure his failure would lead to his exile or worse, execution. The group stepped up to the cell door and Persian stood up. He walked to the door and began laughing.
I knew you would decide my fate one day, Hiroshi, whether from you taking your long overdue vengeance or from simply turning me in. It didn't matter. My son has finally caught up with me. How does it feel seeing me behind bars? Does it make you happy?
Persian said as he leaned his arms against the door.
I take no pleasure in seeing you like this. Mother is a whore and you are a murderer. At least I rose above the shit and made a new life for myself,
Cress said, frustrated by her father's words.
A cinder is no better than a murderer. You and I have killed for profit, there is no difference,
Persian replied with a wicked smile. Cress was about to retort, but Neela spoke first.
I am the judge and jury today. Whatever I decide is what fate will befall you. Take no pleasure in the fact your daughter is here, as she isn't the one who will end your life. I am.
Persian looked at her with nothing but hatred.
I don't give a fuck what my daughter is here for. You support mental illness and lies. As if a man would ever be born in my bloodline who betrayed the truth of what they are. Cress is a lie and he knows it,
Persian said, and Cress was holding back her color from unleashing against him.
I believe you are denying the real truth because you are too blind to see the facts. I chose to be a girl and you hated me for it. You beat me daily because I wasn't your perfect son. You are delusional and broken,
Cress said, almost yelling at her father.
Lie to yourself all you want, but you will come to the truth sooner or later,
Persian said, then walked away from the door. Cress was tempted to break down the door and murder her own father, but knew they needed answers.
I think we should take this conversation to your throne, don't you agree?
Neela asked, keeping Cress from arguing any further.
I do. Perhaps there he will feel more comfortable to answer the questions we have all been thinking,
Lion said, and motioned for her guards to unlock his cell. The guards obeyed, stepping forward and unlocked the door. They grabbed Persian and put cuffs on his hands behind his back and walked him out of the cell. He passed by Cress and smirked.